Arizona sits on one of the most contested and least understood geological landscapes in the American West. Beneath its plateaus and canyon walls run uranium deposits that fueled decades of Cold War extraction, cave systems that held wildlife secrets for millennia before anyone mapped them, and sealed mine shafts from a dozen different boom and bust cycles that left behind contamination no one has fully quantified. Some of these places are closed because of what the federal government put inside them. Some are closed because of what the mining industry left behind. And some are closed because what lives in them has proven harder to protect above ground than below it. This video counts down 9 real underground places in Arizona, from a uranium mine sitting directly on the edge of the most visited national park in the western United States, its radioactive drainage still leaching into creek water that hikers are explicitly warned not to drink, to a network of Cold War missile silos scattered beneath the southern Arizona desert, 17 of which were sealed shut, and never opened again after the weapons they once held were removed. Every site on this list is documented in National Park Service records, Environmental Protection Agency filings, Federal Wildlife Refuge Management documents, or Department of Defense disclosures. None of them allow unrestricted public access. Stay with me to the end, because the final site on this list was kept secret for 14 years by the 2 men who discovered it, not because it was dangerous, but because they understood that the moment people knew it existed, keeping it the way they found it would become nearly impossible. Let's begin. In the Tonto National Forest and surrounding areas of central Arizona, the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service have sealed or gated hundreds of historic mine portals left behind by prospectors who worked the region's gold, silver, and copper deposits through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The sealing program, which accelerated significantly following federal abandoned mine land legislation passed in the 1990s, was driven by a combination of safety concerns ranging from structural instability and toxic gas accumulation to the presence of bat populations that qualified for protection under the Federal Endangered Species Act. The central Arizona highlands, running through the Mazatzal and Sierra Ancha mountain ranges, contain some of the densest concentrations of abandoned mine workings in the state, with local accounts suggesting hundreds of individual shafts, drifts, and prospect holes scattered across terrain that has been accessible to prospectors since the 1870s. The quality of historical records for these sites varies enormously. Some mines were worked by established companies and generated systematic documentation, while others were dug by individual prospectors who left behind little more than a hole in the ground and, occasionally, a hand-drawn map that has since been lost or separated from any living person who knew how to read it. The Bureau of Land Management's Abandoned Mine Lands program in Arizona has identified and sealed a large number of mine portals specifically because the underground spaces they once provided access to now serve as critical habitat for bat species that roost, hibernate, or raise their young in the darkness below. Several species found using sealed Tonto National Forest mine workings are listed under federal protection, and the decision to seal the portals was made in coordination with the Fish and Wildlife Service, specifically to prevent human disturbance of colonies that had no other suitable habitat in the surrounding landscape. In the canyon country north and northwest of the Grand Canyon, in the watershed that drains ultimately to the Colorado River through a series of remote side canyons and springs, several uranium mines operated during the Cold War and left behind a legacy of contamination that federal water quality surveys have continued to document for decades since the last ore shipments left the region. The mines in this area, sometimes referred to collectively as the Kanab Creek Watershed Uranium Mining District, were the subject of ongoing federal review in the years leading up to a mining moratorium imposed on approximately 1 million acres surrounding Grand Canyon National Park, beginning in 2012. Among the most documented contamination concerns in this zone are the findings of United States Geological Survey water quality studies that identified 15 springs and 5 wells within the surrounding region with dissolved uranium concentrations exceeding the Environmental Protection Agency's standards for safe drinking water. The connection between these readings and the historic mine workings was not always straightforward to trace, given the complexity of the canyon's underground hydrology. But the survey's findings contributed to the federal decision to impose the moratorium rather than allow new mine development while the groundwater system remained incompletely understood. Access to the former mine sites in this watershed is restricted through a combination of federal land closures, the remote and physically demanding terrain of the canyon system itself, and the active monitoring programs that have replaced the extraction operations of earlier decades. Several of the old mine portals in this area remain sealed or gated, with the underground workings themselves subject to ongoing hydrological monitoring through boreholes and spring sampling that does not require re-entering the original mine shafts, a practical acknowledgement that the underground spaces themselves can now be studied more safely from the outside than by sending people into passages, whose structural condition, after decades of abandonment, cannot be guaranteed. Scattered across the rolling grasslands and scrub desert south of Tucson in a broad arc stretching from the Sahuarita area west toward the Arizona-Sonora border, the remains of 18 Titan II intercontinental ballistic missile launch complexes sit beneath the surface of the southern Arizona landscape, 17 of them sealed and decommissioned when the Titan II program was retired in the early 1980s, and one converted into a museum that represents the only publicly accessible Titan II facility remaining anywhere in the country. Each of the sealed sites consists of a complex of underground structures connected by tunnels, including a launch control center buried beneath several feet of reinforced concrete, a crew quarters area, and the launch duct itself descending several stories into the desert floor where the missile once stood. When the sites were decommissioned, the missiles were removed, the underground structures were sealed against unauthorized entry, and the surface facilities were demolished or removed. What remains at most of the 17 sealed sites is a patch of desert, with some concrete remnants at ground level, the underground complex sitting intact below, sealed by blast doors and concrete fills that were specifically designed to prevent re-entry. The sealed Titan II sites are distributed across Pima, Santa Cruz, and Pinal counties, some on land that has since been developed for other purposes, others on remote agricultural land, and a handful on the outskirts of suburban areas that grew considerably in the decades after the missile complex beneath them was locked for the last time. Their precise locations are documented in federal records that are available to researchers, but the sites themselves are not accessible, the underground space is not open for inspection, and the communities built above and around several of them largely unaware of what the ground beneath their feet once held. In the dry highlands of the Coconino Plateau and the canyon country of northern Arizona, bat populations that have long used the region's abundant cave and mine systems for roosting and hibernation faced a new threat beginning in 2019, when the fungal pathogen responsible for white nose syndrome was detected within Grand Canyon National Park itself, the first confirmed presence of the disease in Arizona. White nose syndrome, which has killed an estimated 6 million bats across North America since its discovery in the northeastern United States in the mid-2000s, spreads in part through contaminated gear and clothing carried by human visitors between cave systems, making recreational caving a recognized pathway for transmitting the disease to previously unaffected colonies. The detection at Grand Canyon prompted the National Park Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service to implement and reinforce cave closure protocols specifically for sites within the park and surrounding national forest land that had been identified as bat habitat. Several caves and mine adits in the region that had previously been accessible to permitted recreational cavers were placed under stricter access controls, and the monitoring programs already in place to track the park's bat populations were expanded to assess whether the fungus was spreading beyond the initial detection point. The challenge presented by white nose syndrome in the Arizona Canyon country is compounded by the complexity of the terrain, which contains numerous caves and mine workings that have never been fully inventoried, and some that are not accessible even to researchers without significant technical caving equipment. Managing human access to a system of underground spaces that has never been comprehensively mapped, in a landscape where the underground connection between a sealed cave and a bat colony's hibernation site may run for miles through passages too small for people, requires a precautionary approach that errs firmly on the side of closing more rather than fewer entrances. The old copper mining district surrounding Jerome in the mountains of Yavapai County in north-central Arizona presents one of the more unusual cases of an inhabited community sitting directly above an extensive network of sealed and partially flooded underground workings. Jerome was a major copper production center for several decades in the early 20th century, and the United Verde Mine and its various associated operations produced ore through a combination of surface and underground methods that left the town sitting on a honeycombed substrate of old tunnels, drifts, and worked-out chambers. The economic connection between Jerome's underground and its surface was sometimes dramatic and occasionally destructive. Blasting operations associated with the transition to open-pit mining methods caused structural movement throughout the hillside on which the town sat, and some historic buildings shifted measurably from their original positions, a process so gradual and persistent that certain structures moved incrementally for years. The town's connection to its mining past became less an industrial reality and more a tourism narrative as production ended and Jerome transitioned into an arts community. But the underground infrastructure that made the town possible did not disappear simply because ore extraction ceased. The most significant of the sealed mine sections in the Jerome district are considered off-limits to public entry by both the landowners controlling them and the state and federal agencies that monitor their environmental condition, which includes acid mine drainage from old workings that continues to affect water quality in the surrounding watershed. The Environmental Protection Agency has listed portions of the Jerome area under its Superfund program, and the remediation work associated with that designation has involved investigation and monitoring of the underground environment without any plan to reopen the sealed mine sections for any purpose beyond the environmental assessment work required by law. In the Mule Mountains of southeastern Arizona, the community of Bisbee developed around one of the most productive copper mining operations in American history, one that eventually produced more than 8 billion pounds of copper from a combination of underground and open-pit operations spanning the better part of a century. The Lavender Pit, the massive open cut that dominates the landscape near the town centre, is visible and accessible for viewing from designated overlooks, but the thousands of feet of underground workings that preceded and surrounded the pit represent a different situation entirely. Many of the historical underground workings in and around Bisbee are sealed, flooded, or both, a condition that results both from the natural tendency of deep mine workings to fill with groundwater once pumping operations cease and from deliberate closure actions taken to prevent unauthorized entry into passages whose structural condition after decades of abandonment cannot be guaranteed. The Queen Mine, the most publicly known of Bisbee's historic underground operations, offers a limited guided tour of a portion of its old workings, but the vast majority of the historic underground system, which at its peak extended for hundreds of miles of passages at multiple levels, is inaccessible and off-limits to the public. The acid mine drainage produced by the sulfide ore minerals exposed during decades of Bisbee mining continues to affect local water quality, and the Environmental Protection Agency has maintained involvement in monitoring and remediation activities at the site for many years. The underground environment that produced this drainage, and that continues to be the source of ongoing contamination through its interaction with infiltrating groundwater, sits sealed beneath and around one of Arizona's most visited historic communities, its extent understood only approximately, and its interior condition not directly observable without re-entering passages that know current management. Plan calls for opening. The Orphan Mine, located on the south rim of the Grand Canyon approximately 1 mile from Grand Canyon Village, may be the single most consequential sealed mine site in the Arizona National Park system, not because of its size or the volume of ore it produced, but because of where its contamination goes. The mine was originally staked in the late 19th century as a copper prospect and changed hands several times before uranium exploration in the mid-20th century revealed that the ore body beneath the south rim contained commercially significant concentrations of uranium. Mining operations continued into the late 1960s, producing hundreds of thousands of tons of ore, before the company ceased operations and, facing the costs of cleanup, declared bankruptcy and left the site to the federal government when the National Park Service acquired the property. The contamination legacy of the Orphan Mine does not stay conveniently on the south rim. Water infiltrating the mine workings picks up dissolved uranium and carries it underground through the complex hydrological system of the canyon, eventually emerging at springs and seeps hundreds of feet below the rim. The most documented example is Horn Creek, a water source historically used by backpackers on one of the canyon's most popular backcountry routes, where uranium concentrations measured by government scientists have consistently exceeded the Environmental Protection Agency's safe drinking water standards. The National Park Service places explicit warnings in its trail descriptions, cautioning hikers against drinking from Horn Creek or the water of Salt Creek, another affected drainage. The Orphan Mine site itself is fenced and marked with restricted access signage, designated a federal Superfund site, and subject to an ongoing cleanup process that the Park Service has described as requiring phased work and significant funding over an extended period. No member of the public is permitted to enter the former mine site, and most Park Service employees are also excluded from the area. The uranium that entered Horn Creek from those workings, and that continues to leach from the surrounding rock decades after the last ore car left the canyon rim, flows downward through the same geological system that has been building the Grand Canyon for millions of years, carrying through rock that will hold it for longer than any remediation program is likely to run. The Pinyon Plain Mine, known for most of its operational history as Canyon Mine, sits in the Kaibab National Forest roughly 10 miles south of the Grand Canyon's South Rim entrance, in a forested meadow above the aquifer system that feeds springs deep inside the canyon. The mine was permitted in the 1980s, drilled and partially developed, then placed on standby when uranium prices collapsed. For more than 2 decades, the mine shaft sat idle while underground water continued to accumulate inside it. When United States Geological Survey hydrologists investigated the standby mine in the 2000s as part of a broader study of water resources in the Grand Canyon region, they found approximately 2 million gallons of water accumulated in the mine shaft, water that had been in contact with uranium-bearing ore for the duration of the mine's idle period. Their findings contributed to the scientific basis for the federal mining moratorium imposed on 1 million acres surrounding the Grand Canyon beginning in 2012, a moratorium intended to allow time for a more complete understanding of the canyon's groundwater system before new development proceeded. The Pinyon Plain Mine eventually resumed operations after the moratorium expired, making it an active facility rather than a sealed one. But the underground shaft itself and the operations conducted within it are not open to public observation or entry. The site represents the clearest active example in Arizona of the unresolved tension between the economic value of uranium beneath the canyon's rim and the groundwater system that connects that rim to the springs and seeps on which life inside one of the most visited landscapes in the country depends. Whatever is in the shaft, and whatever the shaft is doing to the water table above which it sits, is not something that any member of the public can go underground to observe. In November of 1974, 2 cavers named Gary Tenen and Randy Tufts were exploring the limestone hills at the base of the Whetstone Mountains in southeastern Arizona when they found a small, obscure opening in the rock that turned out to lead into one of the most significant cave systems ever discovered in the American Southwest. The cave was vast, filled with live formations in extraordinary condition, warm and humid from the water still actively building its limestone structures, and unlike most significant cave discoveries, it had apparently been left completely undisturbed by the human activity that had altered so much of the surrounding landscape. Tenen and Tufts made a decision that they later described as defining their entire subsequent relationship with the cave. They told no one. For 14 years, they returned alone, careful to leave nothing behind and disturb nothing, while they considered what the discovery meant and how the cave could best be protected. They eventually shared their find with the Kartchner family who owned the land, and together they worked with the Arizona State Park system to develop the cave for public access in a way that would not destroy what they had spent 14 years protecting. Kartchner Caverns State Park opened to visitors in 1999, and the cave's rotunda and formation-filled galleries are available on guided tours today. But a significant portion of the cave is not. The Big Room, the largest chamber in the system and the home of the cave's colony of cave myotis bats, is closed to all public visitors from mid-April through mid-September each year, a 5-month window that covers the entire maternity season when the bats return to the cave to give birth and raise their young. The closure applies not just to casual visitors, but to nearly all access, maintained specifically because the bat's sensitivity to human presence during this period is sufficient that the disruption of repeated visitation could cause females to abandon their pups. What makes Kartchner unusual in the context of this list is not the nature of its restriction, which is biological, not radiological or structural, but the fact that the restriction is the deliberate choice of a state park system that could easily have chosen otherwise. The cave's founders understood, across 14 years of private visits, that what made the place worth protecting was its completeness, the fact that it existed as it had for tens of thousands of years without the marks of human passage. The 5 months of each year when the big room closes is the park's ongoing acknowledgement that some part of what was found in those hills in 1974 is worth keeping, and that keeping it means accepting that there are rooms in this cave that most people who visit will never be permitted to enter. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, let us know in the comments which of these 9 places surprised you the most, and we'll see you in the next one.